For years, Blake Shelton existed inside a story that never seemed to belong to him. Headlines spoke with certainty about a marriage they claimed was unraveling, even as the people inside it kept living their lives. At first, Blake treated the noise like comedy, a punchline that came with fame. But something shifted over time. The jokes stopped landing. The repetition became exhausting. And what once felt ridiculous began to feel revealing, not about his relationship, but about the world watching it. This documentary isn't about whether Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani are happy or unhappy. It's about how modern narratives are built, how silence gets misinterpreted, and how love looks when it refuses to perform. Because sometimes, the loudest stories are the least true, and the quietest ones carry the most weight. When Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani became a public couple, scrutiny didn't just increase, it transformed. Coverage shifted from curiosity to surveillance. Every appearance or lack of one became data. If they were photographed together, the narrative leaned toward reassurance. If weeks passed without images, speculation filled the gap. This wasn't journalism. It was pattern recognition without context. Blake later described the absurd rhythm of it all, how strangers felt entitled to declare emotional realities based solely on visibility. The irony was sharp. Two artists known for expressing vulnerability were being judged for not constantly displaying it. What the audience rarely considered was logistics, careers in different cities, commitments pulling them in opposite directions, and the simple truth that real intimacy often happens off camera. But the machine didn't pause for nuance. It only needed absence to manufacture certainty. The exhaustion wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Blake began to notice something unsettling. Images online looked real enough to momentarily confuse him. Photos appeared to show moments he didn't remember, clothes he never owned, cars he'd never driven. These weren't just rumors anymore. They were distortions with visual credibility. That realization marked a turning point. It wasn't paranoia, it was recognition. Blake openly admitted that he no longer trusted what he saw online, not because he was defensive, but because the line between truth and fabrication had dissolved. In that moment, the issue stopped being about marriage rumors. It became about reality itself. When repetition replaces verification, denial becomes pointless, and silence stops being weakness, it becomes self-preservation. To understand why this silence mattered, you have to look backward. Long before Gwen Stefani entered his life, Blake Shelton had already endured loss. The death of his brother left a permanent fracture, one that reshaped how he processed grief. Years later, losing his father added another layer of unresolved pain. These weren't moments that faded with time. They accumulated quietly, shaping his emotional language and eventually his music. Then came the collapse of his marriage to Miranda Lambert, a relationship built on shared ambition and public success, yet unable to withstand private strain. When it ended, Blake was at the peak of his career and the hollowest point of his personal life. Fame offered no insulation. If anything, it amplified the loneliness. At the same time, Gwen Stefani was facing her own reckoning. After decades of partnership and a life built around family, her marriage ended in betrayal. The fallout wasn't just public, it was deeply internal. Gwen later spoke about insecurity creeping in, about questioning her worth, her age, and her future. Despite a career defined by reinvention, she found herself stripped of certainty. The world reduced her divorce to gossip, but the reality was a woman rebuilding from emotional shock while raising 3 children. Her vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was honesty. And that honesty would later become a point of misunderstanding when outsiders mistook openness for instability. When Blake and Gwen connected, it wasn't during triumph. It was during collapse. Both have said this plainly. Their lives were unraveling simultaneously. There was no fantasy, no grand plan, no expectation that love would fix anything. What bound them together was recognition. They saw the same fatigue in each other, the same fear that maybe happiness had already passed them by. Blake later described that period as the darkest time of his life, and yet, paradoxically, the most meaningful. Because for the first time, pain didn't need to be explained. It was understood. And that shared understanding became the foundation of something far quieter and far stronger than spectacle. As their relationship settled into something real, the outside world began waiting for proof that it would fail. When proof didn't exist, interpretation stepped in. Music became the next target. Blake released songs that carried melancholy, regret, and emotional distance, themes he had explored his entire career. But this time, listeners blurred the line between art and autobiography. Every lyric became a clue, every performance a confession. The assumption was simple: happiness should erase sadness. But artists don't work that way. Blake wasn't writing about his marriage falling apart. He was writing from a lifetime of emotional memory, and that distinction was ignored. The speculation intensified when Blake and Gwen released music together. A duet exploring uncertainty and distance was immediately framed as a coded message. Headlines suggested it revealed cracks behind closed doors. Blake pushed back, explaining that the song captured a feeling, not a fact. But by then, the narrative had momentum. Context didn't matter. Interpretation did. What went unnoticed was the irony. Two people openly collaborating creatively were being accused of emotional separation. The public wanted drama. Subtlety didn't satisfy. Gwen's honesty became another point of distortion. When she spoke about insecurity or self-doubt, those admissions were stripped of nuance. Instead of being seen as reflections of personal growth, they were repackaged as warning signs. In reality, Gwen later clarified that much of her anxiety came from her own internal dialogue, not from anything Blake had done. But headlines don't thrive on clarification. They thrive on implication. Vulnerability was mistaken for fragility. Transparency for instability. Eventually, Blake stopped correcting the record. Not because the rumors were true, but because correction fed the system producing them. Every denial generated another article. Every explanation became another angle. During a candid radio interview, Blake finally articulated what he had accepted. The stories followed a mechanical cycle. Photos meant reconciliation. Absence meant divorce. Facts never changed, only captions did. And in that realization, something shifted. Silence stopped being avoidance. It became intention. What disturbed Blake most wasn't being misunderstood. It was realizing how convincing falsehoods had become. Images that looked real. Stories that sounded plausible. Narratives built on nothing more than repetition. This wasn't about celebrity gossip anymore. It was about the erosion of trust in what we consume. Blake wasn't asking for sympathy. He was naming a reality many people quietly recognize. That truth has become secondary to engagement. And once that happens, arguing with misinformation becomes futile. Despite the noise, Blake and Gwen never stopped showing up for each other. Privately, consistently, without performance. They continued collaborating, celebrating milestones, and supporting one another's careers. Their lives didn't disappear, they simply stopped being accessible. And that boundary confused people. Because in a culture conditioned to equate visibility with intimacy, privacy looks like distance. But for Blake and Gwen, it was protection. They had lived through marriages where constant exposure didn't prevent collapse. This time, they chose something different. Blake later confirmed something rarely acknowledged. Love later in life doesn't arrive with illusion. It arrives with caution. When they found each other, neither was chasing fantasy. They were tired, guarded, unsure if starting over was worth the risk. That shared hesitation became trust. They spoke openly about fear, aging, and emotional scars. Those conversations weren't cracks, they were repairs. And they were never meant for public consumption. The rumors grew louder precisely because their happiness wasn't performative. Blake committed to long residencies. Gwen returned to major performances of her own. Their schedules diverged. To outsiders, separation meant trouble. To them, it meant respect. They didn't require constant proximity to feel secure. They didn't need proof for strangers. Their relationship existed in daily choices, not public reassurance. As another anniversary approaches, the contrast between reality and narrative is sharper than ever. Headlines recycle the same speculation. Meanwhile, their real lives move forward quietly, filled with routine, work, and moments deliberately kept off camera. Blake's silence was never surrender. It was clarity. He accepted that the internet would continue inventing versions of his life, and he chose not to live inside them. What Blake ultimately confirmed wasn't divorce, denial, or defeat. He confirmed that rumors thrive on discomfort with couples who refuse to perform intimacy, who do narrate every emotion, who don't offer constant access. The silence people questioned wasn't emptiness. It was intention. And intention is difficult to monetize, dramatize, or sensationalize. In a world addicted to visibility, choosing privacy feels radical. Blake and Gwen didn't stop loving each other. They stopped explaining themselves. And that decision revealed something uncomfortable, that many narratives exist not to reflect reality, but to fill absence. When there's no content, speculation steps in. When there's no access, assumptions take over. Blake Shelton didn't confirm the story people wanted. He confirmed something harder to accept. That happiness doesn't always announce itself. That love doesn't owe proof. That silence can be a sign of strength, not collapse. And that the most stable relationships often look the least dramatic from the outside. So the question becomes less about their marriage and more about our expectations. Why do we equate visibility with truth? Why does absence feel threatening? And why are we so uncomfortable with stories that don't offer resolution, conflict, or spectacle? Blake's silence challenges that instinct. In the end, this isn't a story about rumors. It's a story about boundaries, about choosing reality over narrative, and about understanding that some of the strongest bonds exist beyond headlines, beyond images, and beyond explanation. So when a couple stops defending themselves and starts living quietly, what does that really say about them or about us watching?